There, nice to meet you.
Sorry, we just have to download Zoom to get it to work.
Oh no, that's fine.
No,
sorry.
So did I. Don't worry. I'm as useless. Can we all hear each other?
Yeah, I can hear you. You're good, Alice. So
yes, I think we.
Hi, Alice. I like your drum kit. Are you a drummer?
That's not actually Alice.
That might be someone else's.
That's very cool. Very cool.
So Alice is in Form 7 at Beechborough. I taught her about 3 years ago, but she's come up with this whole newspaper at school, which is incredible. Got all her friends involved. And so when I read it, I thought she's kind of a budding journalist. It'd be great if she could get some interview with a real journalist.
Oh,
so I'm just
brilliant.
kind of here to facilitate. I'm just going to sit back and listen, basically.
That's fine. Well, I was the editor of my school magazine, Alice. So
really?
But that was at secondary school. Yeah. And I was always very cross because the teachers were they would only let me print certain things, nothing that was critical of the school. So anyway, it's a very good thing to do. Do you want to be a journalist one day then, maybe?
Yes, possibly.
Possibly, yeah. There's lots of other good things you could be as well. Much more useful things like being a doctor or a teacher, probably.
I'm thinking of being an archaeologist as well. That was quite. I like the idea of that as well.
Oh yeah, that's interesting. Have you seen that new film? You should see that film on Netflix, The Dig. Have you seen that? I
haven't seen it, but I've heard of it.
Yeah.
That's very good, yeah.
It's about them. Have you seen it, Elle?
No, not yet. It's about Saturn Who, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Anglo-Saxons.
Yeah, it's interesting. Anyway, okay, well, fire away with your questions.
Oh, just before we start, are we recording or not?
Yeah, I'm recording it on my end, if that's okay.
Okay, thank you. So, after, would you be able to send it on the email?
Yes, of course.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, well done, Ella. She's very good with technology.
Right, don't worry.
So thank you so much for doing this with me. This really means a lot to me.
Oh, no problem.
So first question is, what is the most unpleasant situation you've been in and how did you deal with it?
Well, because because I'm now presenting, but before, when I was a foreign correspondent or war correspondent, I was in quite a lot of unpleasant situations, and that was really the kind of idea that you were, if you're going to cover wars, they're necessarily unpleasant. Although the irony is, the more unpleasant the situation, probably the better the story it is, and the more dramatic the story. So in a way, I didn't mind being in unpleasant situations, although that sounds a bit weird. I mean, a lot of earthquakes I covered, and the tsunami, where you're living in incredibly... I remember doing an earthquake in Kashmir, I think, and I was living with my cameraman in a one-man tent, and it was like sleeping on the rubble, more or less. So you have almost no facilities, but you have to, if you want to be in the middle of the story, you have to live in some pretty desperate conditions. But and then there was just also the danger when you're in a war situation, being shot at, for example, in Chechnya in Russia, which was in a long time ago, well before you were born, 1994, and being sort of shot at by the Russians. I mean, not shooting at me deliberately, but I was in the middle of the city of Grozny, where there were rebels, and there was a lot of gunfire all around me, which was pretty terrifying. In Zimbabwe, I was with a white farmer whose house was being attacked by Mugabe militants who were trying to take over all the white farms. That was in the year 2000, and they had been killing white farmers, so that was quite terrifying, because we were trapped in this farmhouse with the farmer, and I was thinking I, could easily get killed there. So there have been times when I've been frightened for my life,
Yeah.
but again, the more dangerous it is, the better, often the better the story is. So
Yeah.
that's the contradiction.
So just following on from that, where is the most exotic place you have been to, and what were you reporting?
Well, the most exotic places, or the most enjoyable places, have been probably, well, it's difficult because there's, often you're in countries, amazing countries, but with horrible things going on. So, for example, Afghanistan is an amazingly beautiful, exotic country. The mountains, there's such a clear air. It's wonderful skies, and I remember driving in from Pakistan to Afghanistan after the Taliban had fallen. The Taliban were this sort of horrible, extreme religious faction who'd taken over Afghanistan.
Yeah.
And it was beautiful, but incredibly dangerous. So it was exotic, but dangerous. But then I've done some lovely, great stories. Like I followed the England football team in various World Cups. So I went to Rio de Janeiro in Brazil, which was absolutely amazing during the World Cup. My son came out and stayed with me for that. So those are the sort of highs. And then South Africa during the World Cup in South Africa as well, and we just drove all around South Africa. So I'm really lucky to have done fabulous stories like that, and they're they're the treats really, and they make up for all the bad times where I've been in war zones.
So how does it feel when you're live on air, and how do you deal with the pressure of loads of people watching you?
The more you do it, the easier it gets. So now I don't really feel nervous. If I'm going into a studio doing 3 hours of live broadcasting, I actually quite enjoy it. It's, and often things get thrown at you at the last minute. They suddenly say, the other day they said you're going to interview Keir Starmer, the Labour leader, in 5 minutes. And so you've suddenly got to start preparing, and it's all a bit crazy, but that's fun. I mean, it can be scary, especially when you're talking if you're on the 10 o'clock news, and you've got an audience of 4 or 5 million people. It's quite scary if you stop to think there's 5 million people now watching me, and it's live. And if I stop talking or get my words muddled up, which does happen, I'm afraid, occasionally to everybody, or if you just, that was always my fear, was just drying up actually and just forgetting my words, which I did do. I've done a couple of times. So now if I'm doing that, if I'm reporting live, I'll always write down a few little bullet points on a bit of paper so I can look down. But in the studio, I don't feel ever that's going to happen, because I've got my notes, I've got my auto cue with the scripts. So it's there's two different things. There's being live as a reporter, which is quite scary because it's just you standing in the middle of a battle zone or something. And then in the studio, which is more comfortable probably.
So how do you deal with the sadness of some of the stories that you have to tell people about?
I mean, again, it's and I have covered some horrible stories where, I mean, even watching dying babies who are starving in Africa. And again, there's that contradiction that, the worse the human tragedy, the more dramatic the story is. But I remember doing, starvation on the Kenya-Somalia border in a camp, and a lot of dying babies. But the thing was, the more you filmed it, it was having an impact because you were showing it around the world, and you were raising awareness of the issue. And actually, television news can be very powerful, and you sort of think, you're hoping at least that by getting the word out and the pictures out, indirectly you're helping the kids who are suffering. But there's a kind of, you do feel guilty sometimes that, you're filming these kids, you're not actually helping them, you're not giving them water or food or medicine, you're just filming them. So there's a kind of guilt there that in a way, maybe you're even exploiting them to make a good TV story. So there's a lot of emotions that you feel sometimes afterwards as well.
So how do you think British TV journalism compares to American TV journalism?
Generally, I think I wouldn't say it's better, but it's, number one, we do a lot more foreign news, so we're more interested in the rest of the world. I mean, American TV news, because America is such a big country, they tend to only do stories about themselves.
Yeah.
You know, a lot of Americans don't even have passports, so they never leave America. Whereas we're much more interested about the rest of the world, I think. A bit of a generalization, but I think that's true. And it's important because, you know, foreign news or news about the rest of the world, it can seem quite obscure until it then has an effect on you. So if you think about coronavirus, we were reporting on this illness in a Chinese city, Wuhan, and people might have thought, well, who cares about that? That's not going to have an impact on us. But of course, a few weeks later, it's suddenly come to us and it's shut down our whole society. So foreign news is really important. So that's one thing. Also, American news is it's very short. I mean, the pieces are really short, and the bulletins are quite short. We do it all a bit more slowly and in a bit more depth. And as a reporter, I used to watch American correspondents would have to send their scripts back to New York to be checked and maybe rewritten, whereas we had much more freedom. We could just write our own scripts and send it in and send in the piece, and they just ran it. You know, the editors would just run your piece without checking everything first and sort of telling you how to write it.
So what advice do you have for aspiring journalists?
Well, I suppose just be persistent, really, because as a journalist, you have to be persistent. You have to keep hammering away to get your story. So if you're a young journalist, you should keep knocking on doors and saying, I want a job. And be persistent. Don't take no for an answer. It's like any job. You've got to be pretty sure you want to do it, to be honest. There's no point becoming a journalist if you're not sure, because it does require quite a lot of passion and commitment. And it's a fun job in the end. It's every day is different. It's not always the best, you know. You could make a lot of more money doing other things, but it's definitely a rewarding job. If I think if you like writing, if you like asking questions, it's a great job, because you're sort of just always talking about the issues of the day. You know, some days are obviously quieter than others, but it's great, you know, when you're in witnessing some amazing story like the fall of the Berlin Wall, or, you know, the fall of communism in Russia. You're sort of watching history, really. You're very privileged, because they always say you're on the front row of history, so you're just actually watching it with your own eyes rather than reading about it in a book.
So what's the funniest situation when you've been on TV, possibly live?
There've been a few awkward ones. Well, I was filmed yawning the other day, which you've probably seen, which wasn't funny for me. It was funny for everybody else.
It lifted the nation's spirits, I think. We all needed a bit of humour.
The director suddenly cut to me in the middle of a piece, so that was not fair. And then I remember doing interviews actually in South Africa during that World Cup I mentioned, and some guy just came and put a custard pie into the faces of the people I was interviewing, which at the time I got quite cross about, because I thought he'd ruined my interview, but it was really quite funny. That was live. There's quite a few sort of awkward moments, but they don't seem that funny at the time. They just seem awkward when things go wrong. And quite often in the studio, things go wrong, like because we have automatic cameras, so sometimes they go crazy and they're on sort of little rails and they go spinning round like dialects, going round and round the studio, and they sometimes film me and there's just an empty chair. I've been on Gogglebox a few times with things going wrong.
So, who would you most like to interview and why?
Well, I'm a mad football fan, Liverpool. So of course, Jurgen Klopp, the Liverpool manager, Steven Gerrard, my hero, but I don't think I'll get to interview either of them since I'm not a sports journalist. Great characters. Donald Trump maybe would be interesting to interview. Not that I like him, but I think he'd be an interesting person to interview. But I'm very lucky. I've interviewed a lot of prime ministers and presidents, and sometimes the most interesting people you interview are just ordinary people, though, who've got great stories or terrible things have happened to them. Who else would I like to interview? Well, you always want to interview famous people. I'd love to interview, well, I mean, I have interviewed Boris Johnson, I suppose. But you always want to interview important people like prime ministers, presidents, anyone who's making big decisions. I mean, what I most like in an interview is not being aggressive, but sort of playing the devil's advocate, putting the other side of the argument, and challenging them, whatever politics they are.
So, who is the most interesting public figure you have met?
I've met, well, again, because as I said, I've been lucky enough to interview lots of important politicians and famous people. Well, Ella may not remember, but when she was a little baby, so the guy who was president of the Soviet Union was Mikhail Gorbachev. I don't know if you've heard of him, but he was at the end of the Soviet Union, before it became Russia. He had been the president, and Ella was just a baby, and we were in Moscow, and I was interviewing him, and he looked at Ella and said, and she was just a little baby, and he wrote her a little letter saying, "You're sleeping now, but all around you there's momentous events are happening, and I hope you grow up in a more peaceful world." So that was quite an amazing moment. Then I've interviewed people like Bill Clinton, who was the American president, who was kind of fascinating and very charismatic. And some people you interview and they just have that look in their eyes where they make you feel very special. And he was one of those sort of people. David Beckham I've interviewed, I enjoyed. So yeah, but again, it's sort of, they don't have to be famous. Sometimes I've enjoyed interviewing just ordinary people who've done amazing things.
Yeah. So, what do you do to unwind after a busy day in the studio, possibly after filming, or you've just stopped? And what do you do to relax afterwards?
Well, if I was reporting, I mean, they were very long, stressful days often, and it might be really hot somewhere like Iraq. It was sort of 50 degrees heat, and you were wearing a flak jacket and helmet. So the thing you'd really want, although it wasn't always available, was a hot bath or at least a shower, just to get clean, at the end of the day. And even now, I think it's quite tense being in the studio for 3 hours. It's quite stressful. So I like to come home and maybe have just a bath, and also then to exercise. I play a lot of football. Well, I do when you're allowed to, which we're not at the moment. So go and play five-a-side football in the evening, something like that, just to completely unwind. And then you don't think about news or stories at all. You just think about running around after football. And it's completely sort of, gets your brain into a different zone. So, and I run a lot as well. So anything physical, just to take your mind into a different place.
Yeah. So if you were still a war correspondent, or just someone who went places to do different stories, which country would you most like to go to?
At the moment, where would I like to go to?
There's not many that you haven't been to.
There are not many I haven't been to. I mean, somewhere like Yemen, there's a horrible sort of war going on at the moment. To be honest, I don't miss all that stuff. I don't really want to. I did so much traveling for about 25 years that I'm very happy not to get on a plane and go anywhere. and that's why I quite like sitting in the studio, because it's a different kind of life. And it's kind of challenging, but I don't really have any yearning to jump on a plane and go to cover a story. But when you're a 25-year-old reporter, it's a different kind of hunger. You're passionate about going and covering the world, but I sort of feel like I've done that. So
Yeah.
I'm not, and I'm definitely not very keen to go and put my life in danger anymore.
Yeah.
Not at
So
my
if you
age.
weren't a journalist, what do you think you would have become?
Well, I used to when I
What? Play for Liverpool.
Yeah, well, footballer, obviously. I did want to be Prime Minister when I was at school, but that was sadly not available to me. I actually did do some student politics at university and didn't like all the sort of backstabbing that was involved in politics. I did really want to be a barrister, actually, in a court, standing up in court and defending somebody, and I think that's a bit similar to what I do now, because you're you need to be a bit of a showman and to have a little bit of an ego to be a sort of television presenter, and I think barristers are a bit like that. And B, you're sort of asking difficult questions, so you're always challenging the witness. For example, if it's the other person, if you're defending and it's the prosecution witness, you're challenging them, and that's what we do in the studio. We challenge our guests. So yeah, a barrister or a politician. I mean, I'd love to have been a doctor or something like that, but I was never any good at science. I failed my maths exams at school, so I was limited to non-science sort of jobs. But I think actually on science, look at the amazing people who've come up with the vaccines. I just think they're those sort of people and teachers and are so valuable to society.
Yeah. Well, I think that's all my questions I
Is that
have.
enough?
So,
Is it? This should fill a page or two, hopefully.
Yes. Thank you so much.
No, pleasure, and good luck with all your schoolwork.
We'll send you a copy of the newspaper with the interview in, and you can see all of Alice's hard work.
Ah, lovely. Is it hard doing all this online learning, Alice? Is that boring?
Well, it's not as easy as at school, but I do like it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And where are you going next? What's the plan? Because when do you leave Beechborough then?
So I'm in year 7. So at the end of year 8, I'm thinking I'm going to Stowe.
Oh, okay. Is that mixed now? Yeah, because it used to be boys only, I think, didn't it?
Yeah.
Would that be boarding or day?
No, it'd be day, because both my parents are teachers there.
Oh, well, that's a no-brainer. That's a no-brainer.
Yeah.
Makes sense.
Oh, good luck with that.
Brilliant.
It's a very good school, so well done.
Thanks so much for joining us.
All right, no problem. Lovely to see you.
Thank you so much. That's
Thanks,
absolutely
You're
brilliant.
welcome.
Great.
Pleasure.
Thank you.
Have a
Good
great
luck.
half term.